Hey everyone, Sarah Lang here at the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation. Thank you all for being here at 2 p.m. today. I know daytime meetings are not great for everyone, but with the amazing advent of recording on Zoom, people can watch it later. So this is our final report out. It's really hard to believe, you know, we've come to the end, or rather just the beginning, as I said in my email. We started this process last fall, probably, and it's been many months of work with InkDev, and we're really happy to have come across them. Actually, thanks to Sue Westa, who is on this call. Yeah, we're just really excited about the work that's taken place over the last couple of months, and we're holding the InkDev team to a promise of actually visiting Bellows Falls when they can travel again. So I'm going to sort of hand it over to Gary. He's going to give a little more of a specific intro, but like I said, we've been working with them for a few months, and you know, they really go around to communities, in this case virtually, but in the before times, I think in person somewhat, to really dig deep into the small developer ecosystem. And so what we're going to hear about today are sort of a run through of the, I guess, highlights of all of the tasks that they worked on, but then also talk about some suggestions on how we can move forward. So Gary, I will hand it over to you, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, hi there, Gary Fox, Development Director, Town of Rockingham. And just a couple of sentences why we jumped on this opportunity. So as demonstrated by the enthusiastic group of community members that scored building redevelopment in Bellows Falls as one of the top 3 issues in Rockingham, and in light of the deferred maintenance or worse condition of a portion of housing in BF, definitely saw a problem, impacts the grand list with higher taxes for residents and blighting some beautiful natural landscape. And on the housing side, you know, lack of housing and creating workforce shortages where new workers in Bellows Falls choose elsewhere to live. Sarah approached the town last September, October, with this InkDev pilot project opportunity, and spoke with the select board chair, village president, BIFTA and chamber directors, and some task force members got on calls with InkDev, and we're psyched to go there. And so funding it, Sarah, SVEP, has been a great partner, both with skills, time, and funding. So providing some seed funding, and then you know, driving. We did outreach to Vermont Council on Rural Development, Vermont Natural Resources Council, Vermont Housing Conservation Board, Preservation Trust of Vermont, Vermont Community Foundation, all pitched in with money. So just real big thank you to all those sponsors that made it possible to go there. And looking forward for this overview here, where everyone wants to go and what we got out of the process. And I will turn it over to Brian.
Great, thank you, Gary. So this is a little different than the other presentations we've made because there is no new information. We are going to highlight the pieces of work that we've done together since the fall, with the purpose of having everybody who's participating being able to hear what each piece was about, the highlights. So if you didn't get to attend, you will get a big picture of the entire arc of work. And we're going to do a lot of conversation about what does this mean for Rockingham, Bellows Falls? What do you want to do next? And so having an awareness of what the pieces are and know where to get them, if you need to refer to those, will allow each of you to think about, well, what am I most interested in helping implement? And what are those resources that IncDev, the Incremental Development Alliance, has given us over the last many months? So if you are able to use the chat function in Zoom, we'll do a little informal polling, and you can let us know responses to some questions. And it'll help everybody see who's been to what sessions, who's interested in what issues. So this is a bit of a presentation, but more of a dialogue. So I'd encourage you to start thinking about whatever it was you've been involved with in the last many months. What do you want to do next? What do you want to do with that? As we review as a full group, what did we do and what were the highlights? What did we learn? All right. So by the end of this call and with this recording, anybody who's touched any piece of this should now get a good sense of the whole as you think about how to carry pieces of this forward. Sound fair? Okay, so next slide. This is a highlight of what we've done and a conversation, as I said, what's next for you. So in the next slide, there were two major tasks in the contract. The first is what we call a clinic, where we looked and learned about the conditions on the ground, your regulatory structure, your market, the parcelization and what fit, what kind of buildings that you've had. We talked about step buildings and what would fit as you think about what to build next and how do those things relate, market, fit, regulation. And we spent a lot of time in our summary memo for the task one, describing what we learned through a number of conversations, focus group style, with building owners, business owners, financial institutions, and local government officials, right? And as the Incremental Development Alliance, we work with folks across the country, towns, villages, and cities, and spend a lot of time looking at zoning and related regulations. So there were some insights in that summary memo about what we found in your zoning. And as you all know, you are underway with a zoning update. And so what we found in the memo should help initiate some conversations between all of you who are, we like to say, champions of small scale incremental development, with the folks that are undertaking the zoning update. It is a first look. It is a series of 4 focus group on a topic that some people could take months to analyze, but ours was a clinic and a tactical slice at what these different folks thought were the most important issues and opportunities, the lowest hanging fruit, and some of the hidden barriers that we found that are within your control to change. So that memo and all these documents have been archived for any of you and anybody in the future to have access to those details. So the first piece there was the summary memo as part of our clinic. The second couple of pieces were target market analyses, both a residential and a commercial. They are quite detailed. And I guess just for interest, why don't you put a number 1 in the chat if you attended the residential target market analysis presentation or the commercial, just to get a sense of who was at what. So Sharon Woods on our team looked at those two aspects of your market, and we'll talk a little bit about the highlights. And it looks like a lot of folks did participate. And those analyses, that are about 80 so pages a piece, and lots of pictures. Good reading. I always find it interesting to have somebody tell you, what you might not know about your market and why you see what you have and what you would be competitive in capturing more of, given your built environment and your circumstances. The second task that we undertook was to take that clinic information and put it into a diagnostic, right? With the time that we had, we focused on a few lectures to introduce you to some of the aspects that we have found useful elsewhere. So there was a Dirty Dozen lecture. We like to call it the Dirty Dozen of zoning barriers to more small scale development. Typical patterns that we see across municipalities throughout regions. Wondering, for all of you on the call, maybe you could put a 2 in the chat to let us know if you went to the Dirty Dozen lecture. This would have been late last year, early this year. And so as you were thinking about the zoning update, this was common things that you might consider to see if they're true in your own code. We also did a lecture that's accessible, the video, on step buildings. And the idea of step buildings is that we've classified the buildings that we've seen in the American landscape into about 52 or so categories. Making the point that the DNA of Rockingham and Bellows Falls is made up these, 52 or so, I don't know what the analogy, alleles, whatever unit of DNA there is. So we looked in our spot test at 3 of those and tested your current code against how those would fit, how they would work financially in Bellows Falls, right? So the spot test was the next major part of the work. And we'll go over the highlights of what we learned while looking at the ADUs, the idea that carriage coach houses, a mansion house renovation, and an auxiliary commercial unit. Where might those work and how might they perform given the other goals that you have locally? It is, again, a first cut. It's a look at 3 conditions. You have more than that, but it gives you a sense of whether new construction is viable and where, what to do about some of your common issues like the large houses, smaller families, lower income combination that's solved by renovation and additional income streams. So that was the spot test. And then finally, this PowerPoint, but really a final report that makes it less of a discussion and makes it more of a presentation that you could take to anybody. You could cut out the slides that we're going to give you about the summary memo and the zoning and present it to folks that are working on the zoning, and as a way of opening that conversation to say, we've done some work with IncDev. It's time for us to start talking with you who are looking and are contracted at looking at our code and seeing if we could integrate those 2 streams. So the rather than a final report that might sit on a shelf, we were going to leave you slides that you could use, pieces that you can cut and paste from, to talk to the different kinds of folks that some of you will be encountering, enlisting, trying to convert, trying to enlist, as you move pieces of the work forward. So that's an overview. And what we were going to do next is just talk about the highlights of each of them and get into a little bit of a conversation about what are you most interested in? And as we think about either the structures you have or what needs to be created, you know, who would you talk with to move that idea forward in the next months and year going forward, right? Starting to think about who and what are going to do anything with the lessons we learned and the information we gathered. Is there anything to say about any of that before we move on to do those highlights? Okay. So I'm going to also ask Neil and David to feel free to jump in, but also then open it up to both the chat responses, so we have a record, and if you like, conversation as we move forward and think about what next. So I mentioned that the first task before us was the clinic, and that there is a link in blue there to all the reports and the video recordings of the presentations and the discussions, including the small scale development lecture. But since all of you now are experts in small scale development, you may or may not find that you need that PowerPoint. See how that feels. You know, are there people that need to see it? If so, you can give them the link. You could cut and paste slides of your own and put it into something else that you're going to present. Whatever you think you need to help the rest of Rockingham and Bellefonds understand what you guys now know, and through your own experience, right? Maybe we've given you some different ways to talk about and think about and reference your own built environment, which is what you're really trying to extend and infill, right? You're using your own DNA to kind of repair and strengthen your own places. So that's the link. The next step, the market analysis. Oh no, clinic memo. Which one are we going to do? Let's do the memo. Okay. So I mentioned who we spoke with. What we learned was, you know, there are buildable properties. We recognize and we've learned that there weren't a lot of obvious vacant lots that you could put a traditional step building on. But if you're creative and you look at things like side lots or underutilized properties, there were more of those. So you had some vacant lots, you've got some underutilized surface parking lots that, you know, you can see around the country. There may be a movement, too strong a word, but there are definitely folks that are being vocal about higher and better uses than parking. And we also know that everywhere there are people who defend parking. So that may or may not be a conversation that you can have. And we didn't get into a lot of analysis about your parking, but we point out that there's probably a higher and better use for the goals that you have locally than parking cars. And so we touch on that in the report, and we'll leave it to you to decide if that is a battle. I don't know if it would be a battle, but it often is. But just looking at those parking lots as underutilized S, or perhaps changing parking regulations on street, and using the asset of your existing right of way. Wherever possible, we are looking for the ability to build buildings for people, not always accommodating the car, but doing both. That said, we also talk about on-site parking regulation as something that other communities have relaxed, with the idea again of we want to make space for people and for revenue generating rent rather than at the expense of, cars. We don't want cars at the expense of people. It's finding ways to do both. Also, we talk about accessory dwelling units as an option, adding an income stream for an existing property owner, and the second and third stories of your commercial buildings. Recognizing that in that situation, there are financing and funding, both challenges. And so we talk a little bit about what we've heard and what might be done for those conditions. So the detail is in the memo. And again, it's an initial look. It is not a deep dive, but it does reflect the experience of about, I don't know, David, and maybe 40 people, local experts. Anything else about the memo? Question for folks that were either part of those conversations or have read it. How many of you think that local regulation and zoning are something that you want to be involved with moving forward? Just maybe a number one in the chat. If there was one issue for you, would it be zoning and local regulation? And are there any obvious bodies, groups, places for that conversation to happen? You can also just brainstorm in the chat. If you wanted to talk about these findings, these recommendations, is there already a place to go? Is there a body, a person, a place? So maybe we could also do this as a verbal conversation, right, than just a chat box. But it sounds like you've got this opportunity to interface with the folks that are doing the zoning update. How well equipped do any of you feel to have that conversation? Is there an obvious time and a place for that? Does a campaign need to be organized to think about how to introduce those folks to these ideas? Is it more simple than that? Feel free to unmute and just give some thoughts. What would you do tomorrow to advance the zoning ideas that we've talked about? Let's see, planning zoning office.
So I wonder if, the planning commission meetings are pretty focused and agenda driven. I wonder if people interested in working on that here would want to work through of that, some input independently, if that would be helpful to then get on the agenda for a conversation.
I was having thoughts very similar to what Gary just said. I think maybe there needs to be some kind of a separate, perhaps connected meeting time to discuss some of these things, at least in the early stages before they get brought to the larger committee for review.
Yeah, I guess the other thing that I'll add to that conversation, we have pretty traditional zoning. You know, we have districts and, you know, we have a whole host of things you can't do. And it's pretty restrictive. And I think some of the more progressive zoning that I've seen is the direction that we should start to consider as we go forward. Because right now the zoning that we have is, quite frankly, it's not attracting the type of investment that we were hoping to sort of, you know, reinvigorate some of our neighborhoods. So it's definitely a key piece.
Is there anything in particular that anyone could think of wanting to have as you made that case or started engaging planning commission folks? Was there anything you saw in our presentations or heard talked about that resonated that you feel like you want to bring forward?
I think it's just a matter of, you know, I agree with what everyone has said as far as zoning. I feel there's an openness from the planning and zoning office. I think it is just a matter of dated information, and will run up against, you know, some resistance, I think, and it's having the information to present to them for the benefits of why changing it now, what it means for our future. And I think there are examples of communities where they've done that and realized, you know, positive growth. So I think it's having case studies that we can put forth that would be helpful. So, you know, other towns where that's happened, I think will be useful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts about zoning?
I'll just mention something. Chuck is definitely open to meeting with folks. I think, I don't know, I went to the first meeting last month, the planning board meeting, and I'm going again this week, this Thursday. So I think if someone was interested, just approach Chuck or give him an email. And
Any last thoughts on zoning?
I think Chuck is great, but he's got a lot on his plate, and the people who have been involved with these meetings might be in a good position to get together and come up with some, you know, 15 or 20-minute presentation to give to him and some other people interested in planning.
Okay. And we can come back to this as well. I'd like to just shift a little bit for a few minutes and talk about, I guess we'll do this in the spot test discussion as well. But one of the things that you've talked about, you know, as we were engaged, was the need to reach out to existing property owners. And so as we helped identify buildable properties that weren't always obvious, right? The idea that a property owner can add an ADU, that's probably not something that everybody's even aware of as a possibility. And I'm wondering, first, has anyone had any experience either doing that or suggesting it to somebody? Or is this going to be new territory? Has anybody done it?
Well,
I think there's people that have had carriage houses that they've added onto, or they have an upstairs in their garage. When I built my garage, I had the option of adding an accessory dwelling unit, but decided not to. that we didn't want to be in the business of renting out space. So we just kept our garage as our garage. But we could easily have done that. I'm just not into being into the real estate business, not my thing.
Right. Do you think other folks are aware that that can be done? Is that not the problem?
Well, it's kind of expensive to
Yeah.
do something like that, to take an existing garage and redo it to make it structurally sound, to have to build onto it. I know Sharon Bocelli had bought a property near mine on Green Street. And I think she had difficulty with planning and zoning because they wouldn't let her build too close to the lines of the other property owners because the existing house had been gone for too long or something. But she did spend a lot of money on her barn.
Mhm.
And I don't, you know, it's,
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
No, it's been fixed up and everything. But there's a barn there, but there's no house.
Okay.
But someone
So-
else bought the property, but I don't know if they're gonna have problems rebuilding on the site because the lot's too small and you can't get close to the other property owners that are right on top of them. It's
All right. So
a lot that's squinched in.
you do have some folks that sound like they have experience. So maybe one of the things to think about is to grab a few real people and find out what they've learned to see how generalizable their lessons are. But if you wanted to encourage the kind of density, whether you want to use that word locally or not, maybe you use it internally, but really strengthening your residential base, you're probably going to need to reach out to these property owners who have the space to see if they'd be interested and willing, and then learn through the existing experience, what are the difficulties, what are the barriers, what are people on the positive side, getting out of it, to help you in conversations with other folks who've got the space but aren't yet adding a unit. So there's this maybe experience finding to be able to point to local examples, but then also this outreach to see who's willing.
But we had
Hi.
somebody else on Green Street, Betsy, who redid the unit and is successfully renting out the unit in back of her house. So it is possible, but I know she had to spend a lot of money to upgrade the space.
Yeah, and so finding out, do the folks that have done it in the last few years, are they finding it as a positive experience? Is spending a lot of money a sign of investment because they can count on getting it out through rents, getting the money back? Or was it an unpleasant experience, costs greater than they initially thought, or costs that might be avoided? Do the regulations enable this to be done at sort of the lowest cost? So I think conversations with the folks who've done it might be a first step. And then as you think about trying to persuade others, you can share, you can match those people who they can talk to, the people who've done it. The idea is local government doesn't directly control this. You're trying to persuade, incentivize private owners to take this step.
Hello?
Yeah, I've been involved with 3 different commercial buildings downtown going back to the mid 90s, where we added apartment spaces to them, one apartment space. As a flexible thing, I thought it was a smart thing to do because the more people living downtown, it's nice to have activity. And we just basically went through the current zoning laws and it wasn't particularly a big problem to work with. And I thought it was also a good marketable commercial building appeal.
That's great. So you've got some positive experience right in this group. I'm wondering who or what body might find this as something they would want to promote, implement. Is this something that the task force had considered? Is the task force an option? Is there another obvious group, or do you need to create something?
Can I speak a moment? How do you speak? How do you get recognized?
Go for it.
I can talk now?
We can hear you, Bonnie.
Okay. I used to be the chair of the planning commission. I'm now on the select board. Tomorrow night, actually, the planning commission is going to be approving a draft of the new town plan, which we started working on 3 years ago. And they're approving a draft of the land use chapter, which is the first chapter of the plan. And there are in this, I read through the draft last night, dozens and dozens of recommendations for changing the zoning in a number of these ways that you're referring to. I think one of the really big ones, since we have small lots in this town, is setback. That's mentioned in the draft of the chapter. That was the problem with the lot that Sharon Pacelli had on Green Street, is it's very narrow and the setbacks required on either side. There's another nice little lot on Henry Street. The setbacks are an issue there as well. If you want to bring about swifter changes, because this plan has to be approved and so forth, it's important to go to the planning commissioner, Chuck Wise, with specifics, not just general complaints, but specifics. Chuck will work as hard as he can with anyone, but you need to have a specific issue for him to address. So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's definitely, the setbacks are a major issue. So hopefully that can get addressed.
So that sounds like pretty far along, but still open to influence. Does anybody get the sense that that would benefit from a few of you interested in zoning, kind of looking at both the land use element and the memo that we put together?
Absolutely. Go to the meeting tomorrow night. Or I think, I don't know if they're going to have a Zoom or not, but look at the town website on that. But the public is always allowed, and the public can always speak.
Who in this group thinks that's something that they'd be interested in doing? Maybe you could throw a 1 in the chat. And this will be recorded. So if you wanted to see who else threw a 1 in the chat, because you want to follow up, you could look at the video. That's one way. But that sounds like, perhaps there's value in folks working together. Maybe you see how the meeting goes and then come up with a plan as a follow-up if you think you need to. It's a great opportunity to get involved in the draft and incorporate as much of this. We'll also talk a little bit about this when we get to the spot test, because I think there are some things you might want to pull in the lessons from there too. So moving on a little to the market analysis work, I'm wondering, well, many of us probably find it interesting. I always find the target market analysis interesting. Who feels like there's something that they need to do about it, either the commercial or the residential? Maybe that's another chat. You have this, and it's a lot of detail. Was there anything that you felt needed to be implemented or acted on immediately with the target market information? Or is it just kind of good to know it's there? When you need it, you can grab it. Trying to understand people's feeling about implementation. Was there any occasion for using the market data in the short term? On the other hand, are there folks who are not familiar with that work? Should we go over those highlights?
Yeah, I would just say, like, one of the comments earlier about the that there is a cost to like Pat's example of Betsy on Green Street. There's payback when it's done, but where does the money come from to do it? The market study is a great tool, from what I understand, to hand off to bankers or investors when looking to do your project, and to look through the market study and identify like where it shows that your project fits in the information, and it could be, the detailed tables or on the scattergrams, but being able to hand off the market study and show that your project, you have the due diligence, you have a professional market study that supports what you're doing.
Please.
I would like to actually see like how the listers, kind of respond to the target market analysis. I mean, they're sort of intimately involved with property values and doing stuff, and their kind of take. I mean, I guess a lot of this information, can be interpreted by different groups that know a lot more about it, that then kind of lead up to the whole. So I think it would be interesting, if they haven't seen this, to take a look at it and get some feedback from them.
And I think you bring up the opportunity that this group might have to share information on things like that. Once one of you shows the TMA to somebody and gets a reaction, it might be worth sharing with the rest of the group, right? And in this way, we kind of learn, and the group kind of learns together with you. You may start to discover there are more things to do with that target market analysis. Maybe they are not taking it into account like you'd like. Conversely, maybe they are. Like, whether it's working or whether it's something that's not working, sharing this feedback with a group like this, you are the local champions, right? You have all come to this process with certain pieces of knowledge and experience, and you've gathered some in what we've learned together. The next steps you want to be able to share with each other in the same way, so that you're all thinking about what next, what's the next problem, what are the resources, both experience or information or examples or people to talk to, that we can bring to bear to that next obstacle, so that we're always trying to move the ball forward using the best knowledge that all of you have. So I encourage you to think about sharing what you're learning and identifying the next barrier as you keep trying to implement and push these ideas toward implementation. So there was both a commercial and residential market analysis. And, on the commercial side, it was thinking about what kind of job creation and what support activities can you be doing. So there's a lot of detail in here, not just York County, but showing that you've got some share, attainable share, to attract from adjacent counties. And then the housing implications of the commercial demand, right? The need for workforce housing and yet the opportunity to provide places for people in the region to live who already work here, right? So we come back to the residential, a different angle through commercial demand. The commercial demand is detailed in that TMA. Why don't we take a look also at the residential TMA? Sorry, it's hard to direct link. Do you want to talk a little bit, maybe Neil, about the spot test too? Kind of describing the three conditions we looked at?
Yeah. So we chose three types, that would be neighborhood friendly. And we modeled them all against the R7 zone, since the R7 zone is the largest zone in the city and, contains the most population and number of buildings. And what we found was that with high construction costs, if you go back to the back one slide, Brian, you can see that the rents there that were tolerable kind of maxed out at there. If you see new for lease renter occupied units, those are between $650 and $1,300 a month was kind of the sweet spot. And it was extremely difficult to try to get to that with the cost of land, cost of construction. So it's interesting to note that even as much as we turned the dials on the zoning standards, and made some changes, quite a few changes that are noted in the spot test report out presentation, that we were still having a hard time getting those rents down to those rates. And so there is a mismatch between achievable rents and construction costs. So that is important to be aware of. What we did find though was that new construction was probably the least likely, and they're going to cater to the top of the market buyers and renters. But if you're able to do small additions and rehabs, you could probably get there. One thing we did is, you can see in the middle diagram here, the live work accessory commercial unit. I modeled that as a new build duplex with a little shop front on the front. And the rents in that duplex were going to be way too high to make that happen. So we backed off that and approached it as just an addition. Let's say that the zoning changed and allowed maybe along a fairly busy street or main street like Atkinson. There was some type of location-based application where you could build out the front setback to a little shop that would be serving local business. We found that to be a much more less costly approach in, keeping projects under $1 million. I think it cost maybe $100,000 or something, $110,000 to build, a shop like that, and you can rent that out for like $700 a month, which I think is probably pretty reasonable. So we looked at a couple different modifications. Here they're called mansion flats, or we can call them, big house renovations. And the first one we did was 3 large units. So we had one unit like 2,400 square feet and 2 more units at 1,200 square feet. So they were large, luxurious units, but those rents were going to have to be something like $3,500 a month to rent those. And so that was well beyond the tolerable rent range and not catering to local income. So we took another tact and tried to just say, what if we took a house and did 6 smaller units, and maybe there's an ADU in back or a carriage barn. And that actually worked out a little bit better. So having more units to amortize those construction costs across resulted in reduced rents. And so we got to that $1,500 a month rent level, which was just, it was in the range, but we're still at the high end of where we wanted to be. But one thing that stood out in all of these was that we reduced the amount of parking required. And what this does is it doesn't mean that most folks won't build parking, because we find that, you know, developers still build parking because the renters, the homeowners demand it and want that. What happens is then if they're in a situation where there's just not enough room, then they can maybe provide, you know, or count some of that on-street parking as a space. And so it all basically just offers more flexibility, because when you're required to build all that parking, we were finding that, you know, 6 units at 2 per unit, you know, was going to be like 12 parking spaces on a piece of land, and it was going to take up like 50% of the lot, right, and make it really sort of unlivable. And so having that flexibility could help in a project. One, it reduced the cost to the developer. You know, I noticed a lot of gravel parking in Bellows Falls, and so I lowered my typical surface parking space cost to $3,000 a unit from a typical $5,000 per unit for surface space. But still, that's added cost, and it eats up a lot of land. So land that could be used as an income or municipal revenue generating use, whether it's business or residential. And so I do mention in the report out, I have some performance summaries that are on the website, and you can see the 10-year municipal tax revenue that comes from these projects. And so ultimately, you know, the focus is not just on cheap rents, though that's a goal. It's not just making people do development, making it feasible, though that is a goal. But we also want the community to, you know, make these projects viable, so that then there's a fiscal economic health effect as well.
So point out here, Neil provided the pro formas for these 3 conditions. If you're a developer, you know well this interplay between all these factors, trying to find rent levels, trying to reduce costs, looking at parking as a possible way to reduce costs on a particular project, but also recognizing that you might need parking for a certain property in a certain location. These are 3 places where we tried to take number be on buildability, financing, rent. You know, if the market demand says there's demand for this, would it work, and what does it look like? These are more iterative processes, and they raise more questions that a developer just keeps asking and refining to try to figure out what kind of project will work. So to point out that this work is not done, it's just begun, and sharing the learning about even as Neil described, you know, we did a spot test, the rents were too high, we changed some things and got that rent down. There's probably more work to do to make that kind of project work in a particular place. And it's hard. And if you're not a developer, a pro forma is not the easiest thing to work your way through. But a larger, take a step back, what can folks like champions like you do to reduce costs? We point out regulation, streamlining it in the ways we've recommended is one starting point. But you will have to learn what else you can do. What can you control? You've got this great opportunity with the zoning update and the plans that are able to be influenced. Try to affect as many of those things you can to drive costs down that government has an ability to affect. You can't change construction costs, labor costs, right? Material costs, but you can change some of these regulations, and you're underway with those changes anyway. So now's the time to do that. And then to see, well, what else? We came to the general conclusion that most new construction is hard right now. So that's why we looked at the mansion house and the mansion flats for the rehabilitation. trying something out and sharing what you learn, whether that be on paper or real development, I think will help reveal additional areas or opportunities. And a group, what we find is that in a place, South Bend comes to mind, the small developers there get together monthly and they share what they're learning. You as advocates, not even developers, can be doing the same thing. You could be cross-fertilizing with developers too, which raises one more question for me. You do have a small development boot camp. The other arm of IncDev is training some local and regional small developers. They're learning how to do pro formas. They might be a resource to some of you on the task force. They might take on a project that you're trying to struggle with and give you an initial pro forma that you could then react to. Right? It might be hard for you to make one yourself, but maybe that's a role they can play. And they're a small developer who's being trained, so maybe they could play a role in implementing a piece or some of the projects that you want to see happen, like the Y buildings or other things. So to point out that there might be a resource there and some other folks who you could bring in and share what you're learning to see how anybody can get to a project that's going to pounce.
I want to break in here real quick. Just as a kind of a big picture, and the reason why we picked out these three spot tests was that I think as Neil alluded to, when we did the live work, it was very expensive. It was new construction, but I think the idea with the ADU as well as the ACU and mansion flats, those are existing conditions, and how do you tweak the existing conditions for more flexibility in terms of who and what you can do with the spaces that's more productive than how our current framework, whether it be regulatory or just our biases about the way we should live, or what should go on in which space, sort of straitjackets how we utilize all of these spaces that we do already have. And so how do you add? So the idea is looking at it from how do you add to these things, and how do you free it up so that it becomes more flexible and can be utilized in many different ways by individuals who are creative about making a living, and who are creative about establishing a little living space for themselves. And then the other aspect of it is I've got to go. So I need to have Neil take over the presentation. Neil, can you do the screen sharing instead?
Yeah, I can do that. I think as soon as you are stop sharing your screen, I'll be able to share mine and
I stopped sharing.
Where you left off.
Okay, I apologize. Sorry. Yep.
Thank you, David. While we're shifting, what are folks thinking about what we've just said? That might be news.
Brian, can you address, there's been a few comments about many towns in Vermont have a winter parking ban. I think during the spot test report out, we had talked about the surface lots over by the Waypoint Center. I'm wondering if you or Neil can just address maybe creative solutions for working around something like that, the winter parking bans.
Hey, you guys, I could probably share a little bit about parking in general. I don't have a specific solution to the winter parking ban, but it's actually a management issue. It's not really a matter of having space, because you can always adjust the way a municipality can always adjust their plowing schedule or the way that they do certain things. It's probably the least costly instead of binding up land that can be used in other ways productively. So in the same way, the way we approach the issue of parking within a community is it's really all about the management, proper management. Start with there, because you'll find that you have a lot more supply than you have demand. Even though many people will say, that we don't have enough parking, but that's often said in a vacuum, in a very personalized, experiential, anecdotal situations. They may be right that there might not be parking in certain times of the day and at the most desirable times of the day, but you still have a lot of parking. So it's really about finding those moments and managing it properly and freeing up and utilizing that resource that you do have for higher and better uses, like housing people.
Yeah, and I lived in Syracuse, New York, and we were allowed to park on the street throughout the winter, but you had to park on the same. So if it was an odd day, you had to park on the odd numbers, house number side of the street, and so you had to switch your parking, which is not whatever, it is what it is, but it allowed people to be able to park on the street throughout the winter, so they could plow one side, and then the next day they would plow the other side.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye, David. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And Sue shared a link from Buffalo. I initiated Buffalo's green code, but it took 7 years to do that work. And a lot of that period of time was people talking across silos and boundaries. The challenge of parking, just like any regulation that we talk about changing, as Neil goes through and looks at the implications for rent levels and other things, everything's connected. So on something as like parking, I think the next step is to have conversations with the other folks who are part of the parking system to see the development, either opportunity or barrier, and to work through, just start with the question, how can we have a balance of parking and revenue and development? Where are we having too much of one and not the other? But also, where do we have specific conditions that we have to address? This is where the work gets complicated. The zoning recommendations, I think, are challenging enough. Parking might even be more challenging, but we hope we gave you the beginnings of what you can take to the next round of folks, whoever manages those systems, those regulations, and have conversations with them to say, all of our goal is, either municipal revenue and solvency or quality of life or whatever it is. And we found some places where we're bumping up against each other. So hopefully you can take some of the findings as a starting point for that kind of discussion. And then, Sarah, as you point out, other cities, other examples. I don't think there's a silver bullet for parking. It's really contextual, but in general, there is a movement to not require on-site parking. Yet, how do we use the existing right-of-way and municipal asset to accommodate the parking? It is a beginning of a conversation that you can then next invite people into. So with that, if you were to start to engage people on parking, who comes to mind?
Yeah, so certainly this would be another one of the, we're identifying some good topics for the group to address at a first follow-up meeting, and this would be another one. And certainly, we can, make sure the right folks are there, whether it's having highway department input or, municipal parking lots and overnight permits, if it's someone from an ordinance committee. Yeah, certainly achievable to work this.
So I think we described the spot test as the beginning of 3 conditions which raise next level questions for those conditions. If we can shift to the next slide, really the question is, in addition, as Gary pointed out, what audiences, what other pieces of work or topics do you personally feel need to be advanced as a result of what you've learned or what you contributed in the last 6 months? Did we leave anything off that really you care about and want to advance? Not that you don't have enough to work on.
Jeff has been really quiet. Just saying. What are your...
Well, I'll throw one thing into the mix, and for me, I think it's, if we're going to have a viable downtown, our long-term ability to somehow revitalize some of these second stories in some of our buildings. Our street level retail is struggling, but without people on the second floors and creating vitality in your downtown, it's going to be difficult to rebound and sort of bring back, the street life that people feel comfortable with when they're in it's a compact downtown, but no street feels comfortable when there's nobody on it, or there's no lights, or it feels desolate. So how do we encourage, and we've done that with blocks, and we've saved some historic pieces of the downtown, but now we're sort of at a conundrum because we have a lot of these vacant second and third stories, and it's a real challenge, I think, as we go forward outside of the carriage house and the ADU type of approach, is how do we incentivize that to make these spaces viable.
Thank you for mentioning that, Scott, since my background is one of those white elephants that we're sitting on in the community, and I'm part owner of that. So the cost to try to redevelop it is beyond the current owner's ability to be able to do that. So we're kind of in a quandary. Do we have to sell the building? We don't know what we're going to do to try to develop the upstairs. But there are a number of those spaces that are just sitting empty right now.
Have pro formas been done on that to develop that, as far as whether they're monthly rents or condos or that sort of thing? What sort of numbers have been run to determine this?
All I have is a proposal for 20 hotel rooms and 5 apartments. That was done several years ago by Stevens.
Okay.
That's the materials I have that I can show you. But it was also not really viable because it was supposed to be putting a special atrium room upstairs, which we don't need. So that was an added expense that was stuck on there.
Is that something a committee could look at as a group, just to see where, maybe it's not 20 hotel rooms, but it's 8 hotel rooms and some monthly rentals and some condos? That I think there are some people that would be interested in, either downsizing or getting away from single family and into condo type situations where they can walk to the businesses that are downtown, and
Yeah, and again, we don't have on-site parking for those people. We have an agreement with the town at the what was called the Elks lot or the Buckley building lot.
right.
But we do have an agreement for some parking. Yeah, I'd be willing to talk about it. I'm sure Tony would be. Tony,
Right.
the other partners.
And to me, I think if we're pursuing this, I think the other piece of this that's critically important is, especially with Vermont winters, the type of person that might invest in a condo in downtown Bellows Falls probably wants covered parking, right? I mean, those are the types of things they don't want to park. And you know, I'm glad we have surface parking. I'm not trying to take it away. It serves a purpose. But if we're going to market to that type of a buyer, they want to have some, you know, they don't want to clean their car off in a 0-degree morning to go, you know, wherever they're going to go. So
Scott,
yeah, those are the things that are supporting, you know, that type of development.
the ideal would be to, we are working on the back deck next month to resurface it so that we can use it for the restaurant. But the ideal thing would be to add some sort of parking structure over there in that corner so that people would be able to park. Covered parking would be ideal.
I'd like to say something.
Bonnie?
Yeah. Of course, Scott is right that someone that might buy a condo for ski vacations wouldn't want to park back there. But I think my feeling from being on planning for several years is that there are people who would like to have a downtown condo to live in all the time. I'd like to have one. I'm stuck up here in a 3-bedroom house. It's too big for me. And I'm on, Social Security. I think I'd really like to see some program to incentivize condo conversion. One of the things the marketing analysis showed us that I haven't heard anybody comment much on is that 50% of our renters have incomes below $15,000 a year. And data we got from our consultant in planning, which was several years old, was 65% of residents are renters. Those are sad numbers there. And if we could somehow come up with a plan or a way to incentivize for working people and retired people to own smaller units, condominiums, and for young people starting out that are working that just don't make enough money yet to buy a big house, like that's what's available here. So I just want to stick that in there. That's something I've felt strongly about for a long time.
Out in the rest of the world, that's what people do. You have your starter home, which might only be a condo. And we don't have the ability to do that here, unfortunately.
Right. I think that would help a great deal, because when you look at those income numbers for half of our renters, I think that tells you what kind of development actually pans out for people when they buy a multi-unit in this town.
So I heard Jeff, I think, mention pro formas, and I would encourage you to, again, use the boot camp developers who might be people that could do a starter project, a starter living space for somebody we hope with the market demand numbers, with the rest of your ability to change some regulations to reduce costs, that the small developers and the experienced developers, even in your group, can find a way to do the next project to serve some person, right? And the pro forma is really, there's no way around pro formas. And it's tough for those of you who have to raise government money to find enough subsidy for any project, much less many projects. So which one are you going to, what pencils now? What can you do to make it pencil with your regulatory reduction? And which small developer is going to do it? Finding the next project, I think, is really important for momentum. And we've seen that places that the small developer can get something going, there's got to be something that somebody can do with what they have right now tomorrow. And if not, what's the barrier and how can you get over that? And on the subsidy side, which is the project and I think you have a couple in mind that you've talked about. One that's kind of a public sector project, right? And one that might be a development opportunity on the private side, but finding projects and looking at pro formas and learning, and then having all of you being able to articulate to a public body, here's why we're articulating the change in the regulation. It's because this project doesn't pencil to give us the living opportunity that you described. We want people of this, band of income to be able to live and thrive here. This regulation prevents that, and it's within our control to change that. If you could find the convergence of those things about a battle that matters, that will result in a barrier removed and enable that first project, that would be a home run. But that really is that's a lot of pieces. So what we're encouraging is this group of champions inviting some others in to try to find those projects that are close, that a regulatory change or or some other funding offset could make it over the hump, and then do it again. And there are one-off projects that are complicated and have a single solution. Ideally, you're also changing regulations to enable, a class of project, a type of project. And maybe the spot tests is one of them. The conversion of the mansions might need both some regulatory permitting changes, but also it may be that there needs to be some kind of subsidy that maybe you can't even provide it locally. Maybe that's something that you look at articulating of the state. But again, having all of you kick this stuff around, maybe smaller groups of you, to try to figure out what could you do that's going to matter? Is it a regulatory change? Is it raising state money? Is it, a one-off? Is it a systemic change? You have a lot of choices. We tried to give you the raw material, but you're going to have to start to pick what next and try to move forward on that. So with that, I heard some talk about some ideas.
I have one more question, which is, I guess, possible exploration. I do have to run in 5 minutes, so I'm going to be cutting out. But I wonder about on the island as we develop industrial use, whether there's an opportunity to mix housing with industrial usage, and maybe in more of a industrial flat type of way where the businesses that occupy that island might be interested in participating in the development cost for employees or what have you. I don't know whether that's feasible, but just a thought, because it is open land. And
that came up with the planning commission. We were suggesting that at one point, and the select board at the time was very much against that. And we also got a lot of pushback from, Bellows Falls Area Development Corporation. What did Gary knows them?
Bellows Falls Area Development Corporation.
Yeah, they were very, very much against that. I think it's a good idea. And most of us on the planning commission at that time did too. But we got a lot of pushback against that. So
maybe it's worth, presenting again if we have sort of a model, something that can be, rather than just an idea to grab onto, something a little more tangible for people to really see what that means.
So right now we have a area-wide plan of the island and under the hill. And on June 10th, there's going to be a few public sessions that will include perhaps some drawings of how housing can be mixed in with the commercial industrial uses on the island. And having that visuals, the feeling of the consultants is having those visuals will help get buy-in for how they could mix together well. And so those will be coming out, and hopefully we'll all be able to participate, and that can dovetail well with this effort.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to run, but thank you, everybody.
We try to end here in 6 minutes or less. But with that, there's one bonus slide that Neil wanted to describe, so you know what you're looking at.
Shoot, now I forgot what I was gonna say.
It'll come to you, and feel free to stop me. I remember in one of our conversations, somebody said, "Hey, we really want you to take a look at the middle school," and that was, well beyond our scope of work. But I did mention that I would provide a precedent example. And one thing that folks were looking at, again, I think it's the middle school there in Bellows Falls, and so this is a successful redo of an old high school that we have here in Portland. And I think the big lesson here was that developers had tried to turn this into condos and housing, but having that central auditorium was the limiting factor. And that was, so when the successful developer came along, they kept that space, but turned it into event space. And so, and then the classrooms are offices. And, they kept the old lockers, which are cool. And then they have a rooftop area and restaurant and bar space. So anyway, so there's a link there. I wonder if I can just grab it straight out of here and put it in the chat if you want to take a peek, just as a working example. If this topic comes up and is ever pushed forward, I offer that to you.
Thank you. I remembered what I wanted to say. So the ACUs, what you guys gave for an example, the accessory commercial units.
Yes.
Maybe on the island, that could be something more, where it's an owner occupied business instead of thinking large scale industrial. There are smaller.
Yes, that is part of the current zoning. There can be housing as an accessory to businesses. You could do ADUs or ACUs there, I guess. Even.
Okay, good. And right, they gave us a great example of that, so.
So, Gary, I think you had alluded to a future meeting possibility. We've talked about topics, ACUs being the last one in the industrial area. Is there any, before we break, any last topics? But even if you have a topic, I guess when and who's going to get together to talk about them next?
We actually have a next meeting semi-scheduled already. I do want to launch a poll here. We've chosen June 23rd. And please select which time would work for you that day. If you can check your calendars real quick. We wanted to have this on our calendar, leaving this meeting to be sure that, there are next steps happening. So
Great. Another thing that works well is everybody being able to know who everybody is to be able to have side conversations. Is there a way that a list of participants from this event can be started or shared so everybody can kind of be able to reach back out to, oh, you said you were interested in this, or
yeah, I think we would need to
you could do that
get confirmation from people that it would be okay to share contact information. But yeah, generally Gary and I were talking, and I'm happy to sort of help keep things organized and whatnot around that kind of stuff if that's what the group wants and needs.
Is there anybody opposed to having their email, I guess, on a list among this group? That would, you just share it within this group, right?
I think most people know each other anyways.
Okay, good.
All right, it looks like most of you chose 5:30. So Gary and I will get together and confirm that. And we're gonna schedule it for the Waypoint Center so we can see everyone in person, see those bottom halves. Sounds weird, never mind.
We can meet outside if we have to,
Right, yeah, that was my intention.
the
was to
chairs.
Meet under, yeah,
under the cupola there.
yeah.
Good. All right. Well, that's all that we have. We will finish up that PowerPoint deck that you can cut and paste from as you take the battle forward and list other folks and you know, keep spreading the circle of conversation with the other folks in town, in the village that need to be part of it, and keep identifying and removing barriers. So, and sharing with each other what you're learning as you go. So thanks so much.
Gary?
Yeah, I just want to really thank the InkDev team for being such good partners and good and responsive listeners. Really good at articulating and getting all your knowledge and skills across in ways that we need. And most importantly, everyone who's participated, because from what I hear, for us to move forward with this work, it's everyone who's been showing up here, and most people are engaged and sound willing to carry the work forward. You know, from the beginning, Bonnie putting together a virtual tour to take the InkDev team around Bellows Falls, to Jeff going through the boot camp and learning how to be the you know, the technical superstar for the work going forward. So yeah. Kudos to all parties, community, Southern Vermont Economy Project, and InkDev. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you June 23rd.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Alrighty.
much.
Thanks, guys.
Betsy, I'm going down to the store if you want to see me.